Hey, this is the Quantum Leap podcast. I'm Matt Dale, and I've got with me here the author of Up Against the Stonewall. It's Andy Mangels. Andy, welcome to the show.
Hey, Matt, how are you
Thank.
today?
I'm so good, thank you. How are you doing?
Not bad. It's a nice sunny day here in Portland, Oregon. I guess you're across the pond over in England.
I am so less sunny. It's been raining most of the day, but that's British summertime for you.
Right,
Um,
right.
so thank you so much for giving us some of your Sunday to talk about your contribution to the QL verse. I've been speaking to a whole lot of the writers and artists related to the comic recently, as our regular viewers and listeners will know. And I'm so pleased because I know we've been trying to find time for the last few weeks to do this. It would have been such a shame if I hadn't been able to pin you down because Up Against the Stonewall is such an iconic and well remembered issue. Um, really looking forward to getting into that. So,
Thank you.
if you can you just set the scene for us a little bit and maybe talk about what you were doing in the publishing industry in when did this come out? So this was November '93.
93.
So,
Yeah.
sort of before you got the gig at Innovation for Quantum Leap, what else had you been doing?
Well, I entered the comic industry in 1985. I had been a fan in the comic world, and specifically, I was a huge fan of the Teen Titans. And I was part of a Teen Titans fan club, what's called an APA, an Amateur Publishing Association or Amateur Press Association, and the equivalent of that is kind of like an online zine or a Facebook fan group or something like that. But with an APA, creators would create their own content, whether it was essays about things or thoughts about things or reviews or original art or comics or stories or things like that. So I was in this Teen Titans one with Rob Liefeld and Hank Knaltz, both of whom later went on to DC, and some other beginning comic creators, all in their teenage years. And Rob and Hank and another guy told me about Fantagraphics doing a book on the artist George Perez, who had drawn Teen Titans, and that ended up being my first published work in 1985. I then transitioned to writing regularly for Amazing Heroes magazine, which was the premier magazine about comics. It was, I know over in the UK you had um, Fantasy and Fantasy Advertiser and what Arkansas and some of those others, but Amazing Heroes was really it was the big boy, and I was writing for that for years. Mark Waid was one of my editors, and through that, I got to know a lot of editors and writers in the comic industry. So when I wanted to move into actually writing comics, I had kind of set myself up because I had interviewed and written about a lot of these editors and creators, and so they were more receptive to the idea of me coming to them as a potential creator. Um, I had also been doing a lot of crossovers with Hollywood. So a lot of my articles for Amazing Heroes related to the the I now call it the intersection of Hollywood Boulevard and Comics Avenue, where the two of them meet is where my career has been. And that's actually my logo now is a pair of street signs of Hollywood Boulevard and Comics Avenue.
Nice.
Um, where it it's really where for some reason this kid from Montana who then moved to Portland became like the guru of comics and Hollywood's intersection. um, the 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 downside of all that was I made a decision in '87, I believe it was. I wrote an article for Amazing Heroes called "Out of the Closet and Into the Comics," and it was the first time in comic book history that anyone had addressed how L, at that point it was gay and lesbian, but now we would call it LGBTQ plus, how the LGBTQ plus community was being treated both as creators and as characters in the comic book realm. And they ran this as a two-part, I think it was 44-page article. It was enormous, and it at this point, this is pre-internet, and it kind of lit the industry on fire because nobody had ever talked about it, and suddenly it was like, whoa, here's this big article calling to light a lot of the problems that were happening in the comic industry as far as LGBTQ creators, of which nobody would come forward with their own name. Nobody in the mainstream comic world would.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the end of the second part, I came out as the first openly queer comic creator in the mainstream comic world. There were people who worked in the underground world, but not in mainstream comics. And I did the first Gays in Comics panel at San Diego Comic Con that year, and uh, they didn't know how it was going to do, so they ended up putting us in a theater outside the main convention center area, and I think we had 800 people. It was just like it was huge. They had
Mm.
no idea, and it was largely because people were like, "What are they gonna do? What's gonna happen on stage?" Um, are people going to spontaneously combust? Are they going to have live sex? What's going to happen on the Gays and Comics stage? And so it immediately, it was like this huge thing that became both a plus and a minus in my career, and as we're heading towards Quantum Leap, it kind of it stands to very much a part of this, because there were many editors who would not work with me because I was gay. Um, it was it. I would say 7/8, if not more, of the editors at Marvel and DC just would have nothing to do with me after that. Or if they did, the only thing they'd have to do with me would be uh, to give an interview to promote something, something that they had upcoming. And so it became an issue for me because I was, now I was now the gay writer, um, as opposed to being the writer who was gay. And it really it had a lot of effect. The people who hired me uh, did so almost to spite that. They looked at my talent, and they looked at my energy and my enthusiasm and what I could bring to the table, and they said, "Well, we're going to hire this guy. Uh, we don't care if he's gay or not. That has no bearing whatsoever on whether he's a good writer or whether he has things he can bring to the table." There were a few instances with specifically at DC Comics where uh, there was a major editor at DC Comics who made it very clear that he did not like me. And because he's retired this year, I can finally say that was Mike Carlin. And this is the second time I've said that publicly. It's not going to be the last time I talk about it, but made it clear to everybody on staff that he did not approve of me, did not like me. If somebody brought me up for a job, uh, then he would badmouth me, etc. He wasn't the only one. He was just the one that I would hear about again and again and again and again from people. And many of the people who hired me at DC did so despite him. They actually, would tell me that privately. Well, you can't say anything, but you know, this editor doesn't want you to have work, so I'm going to hire you. So there was a strange thing going on in the industry. It happened at Marvel as well, although I couldn't like pinpoint this editor or that editor there as easily. Um, in comics, when people don't want to hire you, there's all kinds of things. They could just be like, you're not right for the job, and they don't need to say why you're not right for the job. You're just not right for the job. So uh, that meant that I had to look for work from independent publishers, which is what I ended up doing.
So thank you for that that
Long
in-depth
answer.
overview, and that's really interesting because I want to talk before we go on to innovation. I think we should probably take a pause and talk about your reaction when you first saw Goodnight Dear Heart. I'm also interested in your reaction when you first saw Running for Honor, because I can immediately see some parallels there. You've talked about that kind of that risk of being the first, and how that played out in both directions, and that's really a theme that comes up in Running for Honor. But I know that's nothing to do with the book, so let's not focus too much on that. So, Goodnight Dear Heart. Did you see that when it first went out in 1990?
I did. Now remember back. Well, you may not because you're young, but back
I'm not
back at
that
that
young.
period, back at that period of time, shows aired, and if you had a
Mm-hmm.
VCR, you could record them off the air and watch them again later. But for the most part, you watched shows when they were on the air, or you watched a videotape of it later. There was no you couldn't go back and rewatch it on the internet because the internet didn't exist. Um, there was no streaming, there was no DVDs, there was none of that. So you watched it when it aired, or you didn't get to watch it. And I recall, because of my Hollywood connections, I knew what was coming up to an extent before Goodnight Dear Heart aired. I knew
Mm-hmm.
that it had a lesbian subplot and that it was going to be Quantum Leap's first foray into it, and that it was a big deal, and that they had uh, there was a lot of question marks in everyone's head about how is it going to play in the South. That was what everybody always said. Anytime there was something gay on television, the question was always, how is it going to play in the South? Because everybody looked at the southern part of America as being where all the bigots lived, and it's not true, but it's not false. And especially back then, it was not true but not false. It was where a lot of bigots lived. Doesn't mean it's the only place. It just meant that there was a preponderance of that, and it was also the place that if if a network affiliate, an NBC affiliate, was going to drop an episode and air something else instead, it would happen in the South. Um, so many networks utilize that as an excuse to say, well, we're just not going to touch the gay subject because we don't want to lose this. And in fact, they, you know, on Star Trek, when they had episodes that just even barely hinted at non-gender issues, um, that those were banned in the South. They didn't air in the South. There were episodes about racial equality that didn't air in the South. And every time that happens at a network affiliate, that means they lose money from advertisers, because the advertisers pay to be on Star Trek or on Quantum Leap or on something else. They don't pay to be on whatever Bible show they put on instead,
Mm-hmm.
uh, because they have to have something on the air. And since they're protesting against the heathen homosexuals, we'll put on a Bible show instead. They don't get paid for the advertising for that. NBC doesn't make money, so NBC says, well, don't do these shows that aren't going to make us money.
Yeah.
So being somebody who was connected to Hollywood, I knew all of this was coming up with Goodnight Dear Heart. What I didn't know was anything specifically about the episode, how good or bad or explicit, or I didn't know the contents of the episode. So I sat down to watch it with the hopes that it might be something revelatory and something to celebrate, and something that might open people's eyes and open people's hearts. And Quantum Leap was a hopeful show. It was a show literally about righting what once went wrong, and they had done stuff about civil rights, and they had done stuff where people were wronged. And I thought, boy, if any show can make an LGBTQ storyline work, it's going to be Quantum Leap. Well, then we got Goodnight Dear Heart, and a lesbian killing her lover in a
Mm-hmm.
rage because she leaves with a man, and killing her with a spiked heel. Yeah, that's my memory of it. If I've got a detail or two wrong, that's my memory of it.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I reacted like everybody else in the LGBTQ community, which was like, what the hell? This is horrible. And I just remember thinking, well, I guess they're going to play this in the South, because it just paints gays and lesbians in such a horrible light that of course they're going to play it in the South, because it
It's
plays into
safe.
it plays into their homophobia.
Mm.
I was so disappointed in the series. I was so disappointed.
Yeah, I can imagine. Had you been watching much of the show before that? Did you continue watching after that?
I'd been watching any show that had a science fiction element to it. I was adamantly watching, and I was also writing about it in the pages of Amazing Heroes. I mean, Sam is, for all intents and purposes, a superhero. He's in comics. There's a character who inhabits other people's bodies named Deadman, who's a ghost that can inhabit other people's bodies and try and fix things. And so he was, for all intents and purposes, a superhero character. So I had absolutely been watching it all the way along, and I continued watching it after that. But boy, there was such a bad taste in my mouth after that, and I was just like, how did this show betray its
Mm.
purpose so badly?
Understandably. So how long was that feeling percolating before you found the opportunity to be able to make that right through innovation? I mean, we know
Right.
that your comic didn't come out until November '93. Had you had some desire for some time before that to do something, or was
Yes.
it
Yeah.
much closer?
Yeah. It was. There's a progression there of what happened when I started working with Innovation Comics. One of the reasons that David Campiti hired me on at Innovation was because I had all these Hollywood connections, and I ended up not just I wasn't just a writer for Innovation. I also negotiated contracts for them with Hollywood. And so I was David had some good experiences with negotiating literary rights. Like, he got the rights to the Vampire Lestat, and he had gotten book and author rights, but he was not having an easy time with Hollywood. I think Forbidden Planet might have been the first thing that he did with Hollywood. He might have gotten Lost in Space before I came on board. But basically, when I came on board with him, I brought this ability to approach directly people in Hollywood who would license us the rights to books they didn't want to do. Marvel had done a Nightmare on Elm Street comic that lasted all of 2 issues, and then got canceled because it was too, like, the heads up at Marvel were like, whoa, what the, we can't publish this. And Blackthorne had been going to do Nightmare on Elm Street in 3D, and then Blackthorne kind of went under. And I had actually been involved with both of those projects. I was going to be writing something for Marvel in, I think it was the 5th issue of the comic, and then for Blackthorne, I was going to be the writer of the Nightmare on Elm Street 3D comic. So when Innovation, approached me about stuff, I says, "Well, what about Nightmare on Elm Street? It's open, it's up for grabs. I already know everybody there." And so I started negotiating, and I got Nightmare on Elm Street for them, which opened the pipeline up for them for New Line Cinema. And then because of Freddy Krueger, we got and that going well. Then the question came up of, what about Chucky, who was the next favorite horror villain in line? At that point in time, the idea of doing something, say, with The Shape from the Halloween films, or with Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th films, was they didn't say much. So doing a comic with them might be a little difficult. And Evil Dead wasn't a franchise yet. So the only real big franchises that were getting sequels was Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, um, Halloween, to an extent, even it wasn't having a ton of sequels, and Child's Play, which was really hot at that point in time. Child's Play was with Universal. So we went to Universal. I went to Universal, and I ended up negotiating the rights to Child's Play for Innovation to publish. Once we had done that, then Dave Campini looked at other properties that Universal had and said, "Hey, can you go get us Quantum Leap? Can you go get us this? Can you go get us this? Can you go get us this?" And so I ended up negotiating and working on the contracts for a lot of those properties. Not Universal, but I ended up, Dark Shadows was one that I got for Innovation. And there were 5 companies bidding for Dark Shadows. We were bidding against Marvel, Dark Horse, and I don't remember who there were 2 other companies that were bidding for it. But Marvel and Dark Horse both wanted Dark Shadows, and I got it for Innovation based on my knowledge of how things worked, and being able to point to Innovation's success with things like Interview with the Vampire, Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, Quantum Leap, etc. I was able to say, look at what we do with these and how much success we have. Now let's do this with Dark Shadows. And so we got Dark Shadows for Innovation as well. So my involvement with Quantum Leap wasn't just as a writer. I actually negotiated that license
I had no idea.
for Innovation. Yeah, a lot of people don't, because it's not something that that people talk about much. But it was really, at that point in time, Hollywood. So in the 50s and 60s, there was a huge amount of licensed comics that were happening. Pat Boone had a comic, and John Wayne had, well, John Wayne didn't have comics, but Gene Autry did, and there were all these Western actors or comedians or things like that. Bob Hope had a comic, and Jerry Lewis had a comic. Doing comics at that point was not meant as a moneymaker; it was meant as an advertising tool. So Gold Key would do all the Hanna-Barbera comics, and Harvey would do all the Casper and other things that were on cartoons, but they weren't looked at as ways to make money. They were solely looked at as ways to advertise the product and advertise the TV show further, or advertise the actor further. Um, then in the 70s, things kind of calmed down quite a bit until we got, we did have Planet of the Apes, and we had Logan's Run, and Star Wars kind of broke the ice again in terms of licensed stuff. But there was a real lull in the 80s of licensed comics being hits. with the exception of Transformers and G.I. Joe and a few of those types of books, all of which were at Marvel. So going to innovation with these properties that were not cartoon based and were a little more adult and required a different audience than what Marvel or DC was comfortable with meant that the studios didn't think that, I mean, clearly Marvel had screwed up with Nightmare on Elm Street, so they were not something that New Line Cinema was ever going to go to again and say, hey, do you want to do a project based on this property? That bridge was burned, and DC was only interested in things that were either superhero based or toy based. So really a lot of these and you had companies like Kamiko, which were in doing the burgeoning anime and manga. You know, they were just starting to import stuff over from Japan with Robotech and things like that. So really there was this void of, well, where do shows like Nightmare on Elm Street or Child's Play or Dark Shadows or Quantum Leap or things that are on the verge of the genre but are too adult for kids comics. And so that left innovation as being the thing. And because I had all these ins at Hollywood, I was in the perfect place with the perfect skill set at the perfect time to kind of negotiate these licenses out. And my one request, because I wrote Nightmare on Elm Street and Child's Play, my one request with a lot of these books when I negotiated the license was, I get to write it at some point. I want to write something for this book at some point. And from day one with Quantum Leap, the moment we got that license, which was about 6 months prior to issue 1, which, if you look at the timeline, would have been a couple of months after Goodnight Dear Heart.
Yes. Yeah.
So from the moment we got that license, and I said, I want to write a Quantum Leap, and what I want to do is I want to put right what once went wrong. I want to fix this episode. And Dave knew that, and he knew that was a risky move to come to Universal with, and to say, we want to criticize your own show in the comic based on your show. That's a risky move. I don't think it's ever been done in the history of comics. I don't know that it ever has been. It wasn't done prior to that. I don't know that it's ever been done since. It was a risky move. So he said, let's do it later in the run. We're not going to do it in issue 1, 2, or 3. Let's do it a little later in the run. So that's why we ended up being issue 9.
Yeah.
Was the book had established itself. It was selling well. Universal trusted us. And I had also done in Child's Play and Nightmare on Elm Street, both, I had done LGBTQ characters in them. And in fact, Child's Play, an issue of Child's Play had 2 male characters kiss. It was the first gay kiss in comics. And that was Universal. And Universal saw that the world didn't end, the comic world didn't end. Retailers saw that their sales didn't go down. So it was, it was like, take these little baby steps before you launch into something that's going to be as massive as this Quantum Leap story is going to be in terms of what it has to say. And so the short answer to your question, that's a long answer. The short answer to your question is that I knew from almost the moment that episode ended, Goodnight Dear Heart ended, it was maybe 2 months. I knew something needed to be done, and it was maybe 2 months after that I started negotiating for the rights to Quantum Leap for innovation, and and then got them, and then it was a process of waiting until the time was right
Yeah.
before we did this episode. I call it an episode; it's story.
Yeah. Which came in '93, and I think it was, to your point, it was a smart move. I think the comic doesn't at any point really directly criticize the episode. There's an editorial where you make your feelings very clear, yes, but within the actual story, you take what happened in Goodnight Dear Heart and build on it and show what happened next and create this wonderful world that does put right what once went wrong without directly saying, wasn't that a terrible episode a few years back? So you tread that line very well.
Historically, there's a precedence there. They weren't incorrect in the episode in that that's what would have probably happened had a lesbian murdered her lover with a high-heeled shoe at that point in time. That's what would have happened to her. She would have gone to jail and blah, 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 blah. You know, it's not that was incorrect. It was lesbians just don't murder their lovers with high-heeled shoes. That's just not a thing. It's never been a thing. Yeah. I don't know that it's ever happened in the history of mankind. It just doesn't happen. So that was the problem. But the result of it, in terms of the historically in the storyline, the result of it was, yes, that's very much what would have happened to that character, and she would have gone through all kinds of awful things in prison, and she would have, there would have been this ruination of her life. Number one, she's a woman in a time when women weren't respected. Number two, she's known as a lesbian in a time when lesbians were certainly not respected. And number three, she's coming out of prison. She has no life to look forward to. And so part of the question for me was, how do I make this right? How does Sam make this right in the course of the comic? Based on real world stuff. And it just happened that the timing of when, had it happened in reality, when she probably would have gotten out, if she ever got out, when she probably would have gotten out would have been around the time of the Stonewall riots. And so I was able to mentally kind of say, okay, if here's our starting point and here's our ending point, I always knew it was going to end at the Stonewall riots. Always, always, always knew that. And that there was going to be a choice made, an active choice made to go into the Stonewall riots as opposed to avoid them. I think the TV show, had they done the exact same story, would have avoided it. I think they would have said, well, we'll just stand by and watch. And I, from the very beginning, I made this choice. I said, here's our ending point, and the choice is going to be that he/she is going to walk into the Stonewall riots because that's what needs to be done. And so I had an ending point, or I had a beginning point and an ending point, and the question was, how do I make a compelling story and weave something that talks about why this was wrong without belaboring that point? And that became, make it about another character's struggle with the same types of phobias and so forth. And so instead of Stephanie having to deal with being a woman, a lesbian, and a felon, it became Stephanie helping someone else who was dealing with Black, transgender, and a gay bashing victim. And that was someone who, often in the TV show, they dealt with characters who had far less than. I mean, it's one of the things I loved about the show. They dealt with characters who had far less than, and Sam was determined to help raise them up. And so so I said, with this story, we have the opportunity to raise up this character, and by doing so, he helps Stephanie, and by doing so, he also helps this character, which is his mission on the series.
And I'm so glad, just personally reading the book, I was so glad that you went that route and that you introduced that character because, to be completely honest, a lot of the time in the series, we see the events of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it's telling us stories that I'm familiar with, even if I wasn't around at the time. I understand this history. The story that you tell actually opened my eyes to something. I didn't I didn't appreciate this whole concept of having a trans slash drag artist presenting as a female as a model, and I just that blew my mind that that kind of thing might have been happening, and it immediately it drew me in a way that a lot of other Quantum Leap didn't, just because it was also educating.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something that you were you trying to intentionally shine a light on something that you felt hadn't been talked about, or was I just maybe I was naive? I don't know, but
No,
for me that was
there's an interesting element of that historically where um, there were trans actresses and trans models that were passing in Hollywood and in the modeling world and so forth. I don't recall that any of them were black, and that was definitely something that I wanted to bring into the story, is the racism as well. Um, but but that was happening, and Christine Jorgensen, who was probably the most famous transgender woman at that point in time, was, you know, was became a fashion icon and a name because she was so beautiful and people loved taking pictures of her. But at the same time, they could make it all about her being a freak show. And, it, there was never any pictures of her that were just, look at this beautiful woman. It was always, look at this beautiful woman who used to be a male soldier. And um, it was it was reductive in one sense, and it was completely revolutionary in another sense. Because it had never been done before, it was revolutionary. Was it reductive to her and her journey to focus solely on what she used to be as opposed to what she is now? Absolutely, it was reductive. But it was also celebrating what she had now. What was she offering now? This beauty that she was offering. And uh, interestingly enough, years later, I ended up interviewing an actress who was on Alicia Brevard is her name, and she was on Legends of the Superheroes, which was a live action it was a 2 episode live
yeah.
action DC Comics show, and it had the Huntress and Black Canary and Captain Marvel and Hawkman and all this, and then a whole bunch of villains. It was essentially Challenge of the Super Friends done with live action actors. And Alicia Brevard played Giganta in it. And as I'm interviewing her and finding out about her background, she goes, "Well, I was one of the first transgender actresses in Hollywood." And I was like, "What?" I didn't I didn't know that. And this is someone who I'm plugged in and so forth. I had no idea. At no point in her career had she made it an issue that she was a transgender actress. She just was. She had been a Bond girl, she had been in some well, I don't know that she was a Bond girl. She was a somebody's spy girl. She had been dancers. She had been sex pots on the screen, all this. And because she was so passing, nobody ever was like, Alicia Brevard, who used to be a man, is now our woman in this movie. She just, she just did it. And, um, that happened years after I wrote this story for Quantum Leap, but it's absolutely a testament to what actresses, especially trans actresses, had to deal with at that point in time. They had to be so flawless that they could go stealth, meaning nobody would know that they were trans, or they had to deal with the Christine Jorgensen thing, which was every that's all people would focus on is look how beautiful this man is. And so in the context of the story, there was an element of, do I go with this character as being somebody who is so beautiful and so forth that they can pass, but what if they don't want to pass? And what if the mixture of masculine and feminine in them is at war with itself, and that becomes the element of the story for them. Um, I don't know if you watched Pose recently on television, but Pose was about the 1990s ballroom movement in New York City, which was mostly African American or black, and mostly about the transgender and LGBTQ communities that were part of the ballroom scene. And they hired a bevy of gorgeous trans women for the series, and really dealt with a lot of these elements. And there was one of these times when I was looking back at this story, and I was like, "Wait a minute! I did this story already 20 years prior." In this issue of Quantum Leap, I was dealing with some of these same issues that they are now dealing with in the show, and it's being deemed now in the 2020s as revolutionary. And I did this 30 years ago, actually. I did this 30 years ago, and it was just as revolutionary then. It was just a comic book, so it was a
Mm-hmm.
one-shot comic book, and so it didn't have quite the effect that a TV show would have. Rightfully so. I mean, a TV show is much bigger, but I remain pretty proud of this specific comic, and the things that it had to say regarding my trans sisters, and regarding racism at the time, and what the LGBTQ community was going through back then.
As well, you should. And it's I find it really interesting the observation that you made about this show because on the podcast we've been talking about the series as well as the novels and comics for some time now, and one thing we're always equal parts amused and slightly depressed by is how often in these episodes that were produced in the late 80s, early 90s, is Sam in a position where he's looking from his enlightened future worldview at the racist or homophobic or sexist world of the 50s and 60s and talking about how much further they've come along now. And we're
Right.
looking back 30 years saying, has it though? Certainly had it in the 90s. These are still
Right.
conversations we're having now. And the final frames of your comic, it's not it's not a way that Quantum Leap ever ends. It's that Sam says, "Have things changed for the better in the future, Al?" And Al says, "Well," and he leaps out. And
Right.
again, that's the exact kind of thing we're talking about, and we've been talking about. And again, that the show was always quite optimistic about the 90s.
Right.
That's quite a downbeat way to end, which I'm sure was very much intentional.
It
Um,
was writing it from the 90s. I wanted, and this is, realize the 90s is still 30 years before Trump, and 30 years before America was revealed to be this this very divided country of people who were hiding their hatred. And hiding their bigotry, hiding their racism, hiding their homophobia, which was all freed because of this horrible dictator that was possibly elected. Um, you know, that's 30 years in the future from when I wrote this story. But we're clearly revealed. If anything has shown us in the last few years, is we're clearly revealed as a people worldwide who are still in flux about some of these same issues. We still have massive racism in the world. I'm not even just saying America. In the world, we still have massive
Yeah.
racism. We still have massive misogyny in the world and women being devalued. We certainly still, when there are many countries out there where beheading is still the appropriate answer to finding out someone is gay, we're certainly still faced with massive amounts of homophobia in the world. So um, the idea in the 1990s that things wouldn't have gotten better by the 2020s is something that I don't know. Had Sam been leaping from now, writing it from the 1990s, I might not have ended it that way. But certainly in the 1990s, I knew that things were not necessarily better, and that they wouldn't be getting better for quite a while. But I didn't want it to end with like the most depressive note possible. I, I I did want it to be like, well is an equivocating word, and it could be, well, this is better, but this isn't necessarily better, and um so that was specifically why I edited it in that fashion, was because I wanted it to be for people to get, oh, wait a minute, if um, Al is not saying things have gotten better in today or in the near future, then maybe I need to look at my reality now and understand that that maybe things have not changed as much as I think they have. I like to think that many of the people who watched Quantum Leap and who read Quantum Leap were more enlightened and maybe a little more empathetic to people, in the same way that I like to think that about Star Trek. Um, that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily true. There are many bigots who watched Quantum Leap, and there are many bigots who watched Star Trek. And
What show were they watching? I never understand that. But
I don't know. I don't know. But I can say that I do know that my comic did affect people, and did that there have been, over the years, it's one of the most brought up comics that I've ever written, in people saying, this really made me think, and this really was a moment where I had to examine what my own prejudices were, and it reached them in a way that nothing else to that point had. And that's for a comic book, that's a powerful thing to have happen.
that must have felt pretty good, having come from that, from the story you told earlier about becoming the first openly gay mainstream comic book creator, and having to deal with the ups and downs of that, to then hearing that's been the outcome. It's got to be pretty validating.
It did. Um, the sad part is that it didn't. It helped people, individual people. It didn't change. It didn't change a movement. It didn't change. Nobody decided to end their homophobic church, or their, I mean, it didn't. It didn't. It was a stone thrown in a pond that had ripple effects. It didn't. It was not a tidal wave, but each of us in our lives, if each of us creates ripples, that's how tidal waves are created. It's that, the butterfly flapping its wings in Japan creates the tidal wave. If each of us creates a ripple, if each of us does something good like that, and all those ripples are made, then eventually we're all going to be in a place where things are better, because enough people have said enough of hatred against others for being themselves.
I'm not. I promise I'm not usually cheesy enough to actually quote directly from Quantum Leap, but I'm just reminded of a line from the final episode, and I want to say, Andy, through this comic book, you touched others, and those lives touched others, and it's exactly what you said. It's that ripple.
Thank you.
So I think, you should feel immensely proud of what you've achieved, and those, you never know how those ripples ended up panning out. Whatever you say about this didn't happen, you don't know that. So,
Right.
and it's
Right.
up to all of us to have that.
I did have a few editors afterwards who had read the comic, who worked with me after that. And I'm not saying I wrote the comic to get more work. I wrote the comic because it needed to be written, and I wanted a job. But my main purpose, there was a lot of thought that went into this issue that didn't go into everything else. So I've talked a little bit about like innovation, figuring out when to put it in the run, and when it was published was also an interesting thing. Now, if you look at the editorial that I wrote in the issue, I wrote that editorial in September '92, which is actually 6 months before it was published. So that tells you kind of like how long did it take to go. And then the book came out in February 1993. Well, what was happening right after the book came out was that on April 25th of 1993, we had the March on Washington, Washington, D.C., and it was a national march on America's capital for LGBTQ plus rights and representation and everything else. And I was going to be there, and among millions of people, and or hundreds of thousands. I don't know if I don't remember the numbers to whether it reached millions, but it was certainly hundreds of thousands. And it was something that was going to get a massive amount of publicity and so forth. So we wanted this book to come out prior to that, to kind of make a statement about there being an opportunity to, if you're inspired by this, you have an opportunity to be supportive now. You don't need to give money. Support this march. Understand that this battle, which is being fought by LGBTQ plus people, is being fought right now. And in fact, 2 months from now, we're marching on Washington in the same way that the civil rights marches happened, and the women's rights marches happened. And so there was very much a key thing that was being addressed with this, and that was being coordinated with Universal, with innovation, with the distributors in the comic book world, and with me and what I was writing in the comic and the editorial. And we actually ended up doing an autograph signing for this comic at the March on Washington. But there was a lot of, it wasn't just an issue of Quantum Leap that happened to be really good. There was a lot that went into this to make sure that it happened when it needed to happen, that it said what it needed to say. I will say, you haven't asked about this, but I will say that Universal was never stood in my way on this. They
Yes, I was going to ask
understood.
about that.
Okay,
Good,
yeah, they
good.
understood that Goodnight Dearheart was a problem, and that's why I think, and so did Donald Belisario. Um, that's why we got the Running for Honor story later. Um, but Universal understood that in its realm, which was comics, this could still help right a wrong, and this could still reach as many people as the comic book was going to reach. And um, I don't recall that they changed a single word of my editorial or the comic itself. I think they had zero editorial changes. There were some notes about stuff that were very minor, but in terms of editorial changes, they didn't ask me to change a thing. And neither did Innovation. Innovation said, this is your story, this is what we're going to publish, and we're going to stick to this. Um, Innovation was in Wheeling, West Virginia. They not the most open-minded of areas, and they had a board of directors who could have said no at any point in time. But all the way along the line, everyone understood how important this issue was, and were as supportive as they could be, given that they didn't. The only input they could do was to say no. There was everything was coming out of me, so all they could do was either stand in my way or get out of my way or support me. And so they first got out of my way and then they supported me. And it was, I mean, it was a pretty special thing, and I wouldn't experience that again until years later when I was able to do kind of the same thing with Star Trek. In the Star Trek books, and introduced the first LGBTQ plus main characters in Star Trek in the same fashion, where everything had to be coordinated and everything had to be just so for it to happen, and it took a lot of work to accomplish the same type of things, and um, that was years later.
Amazing to be able to achieve that kind of thing, not once but twice. And you must be, I mean, even putting the Star Trek piece to one side, you must be so proud. Well, it shows from everything you're saying. So proud of everything you managed to achieve with that book. So before we start talking about what happened next, what happened after Up Against the Stonewall, is there anything that we've not covered yet that you can share about the making of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. The editor on the project was George Broderick Jr. Dave Campini was the
Mm-hmm.
head of the company. George was the editor, and he had been working with um, these South American artists, including a guy named Mike Deodato Sr. And Mike Deodato Sr. had been drawing comics for a long time in South America, but he was towards the end of his career, towards not really wanting to continue drawing. He was getting old, and he was done with it for a while. So uh, this issue, Up Against the Stonewall, he had his son Mike Deodato Jr. Um, draw 95% of the issue, but it's credited to Mike Deodato Sr. Now, Mike Deodato Jr. nowadays only goes by Mike Deodato, and he's one of the more popular artists at Marvel and DC, has drawn all the major books at Marvel, and his name goes on the cover and on the spines of books. Up Against the Stonewall is his debut as a comic artist. So there's a bit of trivia that a lot of people don't realize. They'll see the senior and they'll be like, "Well, that's not the guy who's there now." No, it's not. But his son
No,
didn't have a name.
I'd made the connection. But I didn't realise that the son had started to take over and was supporting in that way.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
amazing!
and so it was interesting because uh, there's an element in there where I can kind of tell from which characters are which, who drew what, like which ones his dad drew and which ones he drew, because I'm familiar with both their art, and so it's really interesting as you look at things. On the screen right now, I have a picture of the warden from like page 2 of the story, and I'm like, that's Junior. That's Junior's art, and Sam was almost all drawn by Junior, whereas some of the ones that maybe look a little more like Al Williamson, that's the father. So it's an interesting thing to be able to kind of like sit down and go, oh, I know who drew this panel or who drew that panel. The So that was Mike Deodato.
You've got me distracted looking now. I need to, I need to study that afterwards.
And then the artist who did the cover, that was an interesting cover because they didn't know what to put on the cover. There was a huge question mark about like, well, do we put something that relates to the story?
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, they would have at least put like a rainbow flag over the background. It would have at least had rainbow instead of being all blue. It would have at least had some rainbow colors in it or something. But back then, there was this big question mark of what do we put on the cover that is representative of this issue, or do we put a? So they ended up kind of putting a generic cover. I think the artist's name is C.W. Taylor, if I remember right. It's a gorgeous cover, but I always find it interesting because I can tell exactly who he's drawn where. Like Alan Jackson's a country singer, and he's there above the monkey, and
Yeah.
Chuck Norris is above Al, and and there's James Woods is below Al talking on the phone. So it's one of these things that I can I can identify about half the people on the cover, who he used as photo reference. But it's a great cover. It's a really wonderful cover, and it didn't matter that it wasn't reflective of the interiors, because I think had it been a gay pride cover, it would have scared people away a little bit, maybe, and maybe people wouldn't have picked it up that would normally have done so. So this is a generic cover, but it was very purposely chosen for this issue as something that it's a spectacular generic cover, but it was very purposely chosen to be, this represents Quantum Leap.
Yeah.
And we're putting it on the story that is going to be the heart of Quantum Leap, but this represents the face of Quantum Leap.
It always strikes me as kind of, if there'd have been a collected graphic novel, this is the art that they would have taken for the cover.
This would have been the whole thing of the trade paperback.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
And that's not to say there'll never be a collected graphic novel. I mean, it's, who knows? In today's world of Kickstarter, maybe that'll happen. I wanted to point out something else about the specific, when we were talking about the anthology aspects of the comic and specific writers doing individual stuff. I want to point out that we, as with the TV show, we as the writers and artists wrote and drew the final page, the leap page, that ended each issue of the comic. So if people want to get the complete story from Quantum Leap 9, they actually have to buy Quantum Leap 8, which has the Leap page that is written by me and drawn by Mike Diodato, senior and junior, that leads into this issue. Similarly, I did not write the final page of this issue in which he leaps out. So it's kind of funny because there's not a credit that way. Just like in the TV show, there wasn't a credit. The director of the next episode would film the leap part of the episode that went in the episode before theirs. They didn't get a credit on screen for that. Same way with the comics. I didn't get a credit in issue 8 for writing the last page, nor did the person who wrote the last page of issue 9 get a credit for writing their page. But they were indeed written by the writer of whoever the next episode was. So the final issue of Quantum Leap where he leaps out, I don't remember what that is, but whatever that is, that would have been whatever the next issue was.
Yeah,
so,
but Sam leaping into a baby in a zoo with a like next to a giraffe. So it was going to be the baby leap was the next episode or next issue.
Okay. So so issue 8, if people want to be completists here, if you buy issue 9, there is actually a page from issue 8 that precedes it.
So I mean, a lot of time has gone by. This is not something you can go and pick up from the store. How can fans best get hold of this?
eBay's the obvious answer, but there's an even cheaper answer, which is that every year on Gay Pride Day, I repost the comic in full to my Facebook page. And that is publicly accessible by anyone. Anyone can read it on Facebook. And I'm eventually, one of these days when I can get my HTML correct, I'm going to post it to my website as well, which is my name, andymangels.com. But in the meantime, if you look me up on Facebook, you can look through my photo albums on your Facebook thing. You can look at photos and then albums. And there's an album for Quantum Leap 9. And the page from issue 8 is in there, the cover, the editorial, and the full story is in there. So you don't need to buy it on eBay. You can read it for free and experience that part of history for free all the time. And I repost that every year on Gay Pride Day, which is...
Oh, what a marvelous idea.
Which is, for those who don't know what Gay Pride Day is, Gay Pride Day is the date of the Stonewall riots, which is where the comic ends. And so it's all everything's planned out. There's a reason.
Yes. Oh, awesome. I mean, it is worth tracking down the books on eBay, but they are slowly getting more and more expensive. So, what a great way of making sure this comic is doing what you initially intended it to do and getting out there and hopefully changing even more minds.
Hopefully.
So this is obviously a very personal story for you, and I noticed, there's famous characters popping up like Andy Warhol, Dennis Hopper. Is there anything more personal that connects to your story, your history?
One of the things I wanted to do was kind of have a little wink, wink, nod, nod to you brought up the Hollywood references there. And because we're dealing with a photographer in 1969, that it was important to me that Andy Warhol make an appearance. Like, he just had to. The most famous photographer, and he's gay, so of course he would be attending a photo gallery opening for a lesbian photographer who's shooting a transgender model. Of course he would be there. There is a reference to Dennis Hopper being there, and that's actually because Dean Stockwell was best friends with Dennis Hopper. So I have Dean Stockwell say, "Oh, hey, isn't that Dennis Hopper?" Just as a kind of like a little in-joke. If you know the actors are best friends, it's a little bit of an in-joke. But a lot of the people who are specifically in the art gallery scene are real people. And there's another Hollywood reference in one panel somebody says, "I can't believe Judy died yesterday." That's a reference to Judy Garland, who died just before the Stonewall riots. And that was very specific to get in there because the uh, the lore says that part of the reason for the Stonewall riots was because Judy Garland had just died, and therefore people were so traumatized that they had to go riot when the police showed up. That's not exactly what happened, but it still is true that Judy Garland died shortly before the Stonewall riots, and so I wanted to make sure that that was referenced in the story. But on that page, we also talk about the Daughters of Bilitis, which is the first major lesbian organization in the world. And Sam, as Stephanie, is introduced to a woman named Sashi Hyatt. And Sashi is a woman who, when I was working at a comic book store at the very start of my career, we rented videotapes as well. So we had comics and videos. And Sashi and her partner, Judy Tallwing McCarthy, who unknown to me at the time was International Ms. Leather. She was a very famous woman in the leather and lesbian communities. So Sashi and Judy used to come in and rent movies from me all the time, and they actually were the first out lesbians that I ever met. And Sashi later passed away, but not before she had talked to me about the fact that she had actually been at the Stonewall riots. There was a lesbian bar very close by the Stonewall Inn. It was across the street or something. And she had been there. She remembered it. She described it. And to me, that was kind of like touching somebody who had been there at the dawn of creation. And so when I was writing this comic, I called up Judy, and Sashi had already passed. And I said, I want to feature Sashi in this comic, and here's how, and so forth. And she goes, I think that'd be wonderful. Here's what she looked like back then. Here's how she, so forth. So Sashi in particular was somebody who, it's actually true that Sashi was there at the Stonewall, and she at the end of the story, she's there. And that was something where that was, to me, to be able to kind of pay a little bit of, and she was in the Daughters of Bilitis, and she was active in this. So to be able to pay a little bit of homage to the first lesbian who I ever knew, and to put her in this comic was really meaningful to me. Um, there's a person mentioned at the end there with Sashi, and that's David Kay. And David was one of the first gay men that I knew who helped me really through the coming out process. And so it was important to me to, in the process of writing about the beginnings of the modern LGBTQ movement, that I pay honor and homage to two of the people who helped me kind of through my own Stonewall, who helped me come out and realize and be the person that I was.
Wow, such a great story, and not the kind of thing I often hear. Actually, there's the opportunity to go back and include people you knew and reference people you knew. Not something that a lot of writers took up.
No, it's just kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity, really.
Yes, yeah. Did after Up Against the Stonewall, were there any plans for you to write for the Quantum Leap line again? I know it only lasted another few issues, but had the line continued, do you think you would have gone back and written more?
Yeah, the thing was, I had the opportunity to, with all our license projects. As I said, the part of my deal was, I want to be able to write for them as well. And so at any point I could have had the series continued. At any point, I could have come in and said, "Hey, I want to do another story." They treated Quantum Leap, if you look at the creative teams on it, it was very much almost an anthology. So every issue was being written or drawn by different creative teams, and that was perfect for that book. As long as the artist could draw Sam's likeness, you know, then it was great. You could have an anthology series with it, uh, and innovation was certainly would have allowed me to do anything. I don't recall for innovation that I would have. I mean, that's a lot of years ago. I would have to look back at my notes, but I don't recall any specific stories that I was like, okay, I want to tell this story next. But had it gone to another year's worth of series, I definitely would have written at least one of them. That's I had one of the first 12. Had it gone to another set of 12, I would have definitely written one of them. Unfortunately, with innovation, there was a very quick implosion of the company, and the board of directors dissolved the company just in a matter of a week, and a lot of stuff was unfinished. I was in the middle of a Nightmare on Elm Street series. They published the first 2 issues, and then the third issue still remains unpublished. There was Dark Shadows, as a for instance, that series. I think they had done 2 issues of a 4-issue series, and then that remained unpublished. I was going to be writing the next set of Dark Shadows series, uh, and in fact would have introduced a gay werewolf in that one. Um,
Awesome.
so the the innovation imploded very quickly, and then it was gone. And so there wasn't an opportunity to really pursue writing further Quantum Leap. But I definitely would have, had it gone to a second year, I would have written another one.
That's good to know. I've spoken to a few of the writers, and generally, I always ask that question, and generally, that response is no. I was brought in for 1 issue, I was gone, I wouldn't have come back. They had a good time, but it was very much a once and done. So it's good to know that you might have liked that continuity. Of course, that does start to lead us to this the post innovation world where and I've been dying to ask you about this because Acclaim ended up starting to pick up Universal licenses,
Yes.
and I gather you wrote for the Sliders range,
Yeah,
and
that was one of those editors who he approached me based on some of my past work, and also knowing that I wasn't getting work from
mm-hmm.
other editors, and was like, "Well, I'm gonna fucking hire you." Can I say that?
Yeah, of course, go for it. You said it, so
I I think that's how he put it. I'm gonna fucking hire you. Um, and that was somebody who was looking at my talent, and was also, almost everybody who did that, they saw somebody who was talented, but they also saw somebody to whom injustices were being done. uh to leave me out of the storytelling equation in comics solely because I was gay and open about it, as opposed to all the people who were not open about it, was to them an affront. And so they would be like, "Well, I'll fucking hire you." And so, so the Sliders editor was very much somebody like that, who was like, "Well, I'm going to hire you." So I ended up writing a Sliders story for them. It was a 48-page special, and it would have been wild. Oh, it was an insane story. Sliders is very much like Quantum Leap. I mean, I think of them
yeah.
as kind of being in the same realm. Not only are they
Mm-hmm.
both universal, but I think of them as being very, very similar. Um, and so I did a Slider story in which they slide into a world in which their journeys and their lives have become George Lucas's next movie series, and uh, and they're movie stars, and they're they're the hot new thing, and they have to realize that they're now Star Wars. You know?
Right.
Instead of Star Wars, he does sliders, and that becomes the huge franchise, and they slide into that world. And, you know, what did that become? And that was actually fully drawn by Rags Morales, and was going to be published. And then I don't remember what happened to Acclaim or its licenses, but they ended up not doing it. But in the meantime, after working on that, I had pitched to them, this is what your question was about. I had pitched to
Yeah.
them a Sliders Quantum Leap crossover. And um, the they didn't have the rights to Quantum Leap, but I knew how to get them the rights to Quantum
Mm-hmm.
Leap. You know,
Of
and
course.
so I proposed to them, let's do this Quantum Leap Sliders crossover. And to me, what made sense was to take the elements that were similar and to make that the focus of the crossover, which was Sam slides in and out of time, they slide in and out
Mm-hmm.
of reality. What if they slide into each other, and instead of Sam sliding into time, he instead slides into an alternate reality, and they slide out of time? And so it became kind of a uh, an interesting way. It would have been an interesting way to tell that story had it happened, but that was the Sliders Quantum Leap crossover that was never meant to be.
Such a shame. I think that there's a lot because, like you say, there's the story concepts are quite similar. I suspect there's quite a crossover in fandom. I know two other writers also attempted to pitch crossovers, probably for very similar reasons. So such a shame none of them happened. That would have been tremendously
Well, I
fun.
can
But
tell you about the with the other writers, because I was the one to whom Quantum Leap would have been coming from. Mine would have been the
mm-hmm.
first one.
Yeah.
And then, had there been further ones, they would have written the second or third. This is one where I would have had the upper hand because I would have been helping
Yes.
Acclaim with that license.
Yeah.
Um, but unfortunately, that never happened.
Shame. So this issue is, I think, unique in the range in giving over an editorial. You mentioned the editorial earlier on, and it's quite a personal and passionately written editorial. Other editorials in the range are written by Christina Mavroudis or George Broderick, and they're just sort of facts about what's going on in Quantum Leap. You go through some very personal stuff there, and I mean, there's things about the gay bashing and the physical beatings that gays and lesbians endure on the streets. I'm just quoting from it here. I understand that this also, this was written in '92, but I understand this also has quite a personal meaning to you right now. Can you
Yeah,
share a bit more
yeah.
about that?
So we're filming this in August of 2023, and on St. Patrick's Day of this year, I'm 56 now. I'm a 6 foot man, 280 pounds. I used to box, and on St. Patrick's Day this year, I was gay bashed outside of a gay venue. A guy sitting on the sidewalk stood up, started pounding me in the head, and shouting epithets and so forth, and actually caused a brain injury. Um, and everyone says, "How could you?" Meaning a big guy, my size, my age, looking the way I do. How could you get gay bashed? I'll tell you, if I can get gay bashed, then anybody can. And the fact that I was writing about this in 1992, and I'm writing about the politics from back then, and the things, the fights that we're going through, and so forth, and the fact that now, uh, what is this? 31 years later, 31 years later, I am getting gay bashed. We're still seeing all this stuff happening with the politics and so forth. it's disheartening. I know we've made so many strides. I know people are so much better, but the hate is still there, and the going back to the motto of the show, there's still a lot that once went wrong, and it's not once went wrong. This just happened to me. This just happened to me a few months ago. It's still going wrong. And I would really challenge anybody who's watching this to look at ways in which you can make sure in your life that the things that Sam stood for, the things that Quantum Leap as a show stood for, the things that as people we should be standing for everyone to be equal, for everyone to have the right to walk down the street and not be afraid. All those things that we think of as politics, it's not. It's about humanity. It's about ourselves and what we offer the world. And if what you're offering the world is hatred towards others, then you need to reimagine what you can offer the world. I will continue to offer the world empathy and as much strength as I can muster in terms of standing up for people who don't get stood up for all the time. And I hope that anybody who's watching this or anybody who reads this story not only comes away from it with a sense of, well, that was a damn good Quantum Leap story, but also a sense of maybe I can examine how I approach the world as well. And what am I putting out in the world that's going to put right what once went wrong? We don't have to be jumping through time with Ziggy uh, to accomplish good things. We just have to be better than the things that are going wrong.
And I know that this almost seems trite, but these things happen. It's what I'm about to say is trite, not what you're about to, well, not what you said.
Okay.
I know what I'm about to say may sound trite. It's horrific that these things happen. I'm appalled listening to this story and knowing that it happened to the person I'm speaking to now. But the fact that you're able to take that experience and turn it into such a positive and important message and share it is, I thank you for sharing that with us today. And I think it's so important that people take note of what you said, and I really hope it hits home the way it just has done for me. I would love to end on the usual note that I end on and say, where can people find your work? It seems
right.
After everything you've just shared, I don't know if I can ask that question, but it's I would still like to be able to share
Absolutely.
with the fans.
I'm still here.
What else is going on in your life? This is exactly. So what are you up to right now? Where can fans find you? What are the links?
Yeah, I'm still here. I still have stories to tell, and I still am, wanting to entertain people and do justice by the things that I have to talk about, whether that's a licensed property or not. My career has been, in the time since Quantum Leap, has been all over the place. Star Wars and Star Trek, and a couple of years ago I got to write Wonder Woman meets the Bionic Woman, which, as you see behind me, is that was the epitome for me. I wrote Boba Fett. I wrote what most people consider to be the best Boba Fett comic ever published, and which led to a line that has led to a couple TV shows now on Disney Plus. But I will say you can follow me at andymangels.com, or you can follow my Facebook page. both of them, I talk about whatever my current projects are, but right now I am working on a series called Planet Zolo, which is a online video game, and I'm writing a series of graphic novels for that. I wrote some young adult graphic novels called Fractured Fairy Tales that came out last year that are a lot of fun. They're kind of reimagining fairy tales in modern settings. So Cinderella loses her cell phone instead of her slipper, and the guy who's trying to find her has to go around and see whose thumbprint matches the phone. Um, and so it kind of deals with modern fairy tales in modern settings.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote those. I'm working on. I write every issue. I'm still doing Hollywood stuff. Every issue of Retro Fan magazine from Tomorrow's, I write a column for them. I'm working on a book about the plays of Stephen King, and I'll be kickstarting a few projects over the coming years. Um, One of which will be about America's first serial killer, a true story, H.H. Holmes, who was kind of our equivalent of Jack the Ripper, except far worse. and and as it relates to Over the Pond, there, I'll eventually be once I have it figured out, I'll be kickstarting a project that'll be autobiographical and biographical about myself and one of my distant uncles, a gentleman named Alan Turing. Wait for it to hit your eyes.
Fascinating. Oh, that's going to be
Yes,
great.
yes, he's one of my distant uncles, and so I'll be writing a
Mm-hmm.
book that examines his life as a gay man and what he went through in World War II.
Yeah.
And eventually his suicide, and my life and what I went through from the 70s to now, and when I didn't commit suicide, and
Mm-hmm.
how the LGBTQ community has changed in those times, what hasn't changed. It'll be a really, once I figure out exactly how it all fits together, then I'll kickstart it. But that's on the books at some point in the future.
Great stuff. Well, we'll post the links in the show notes as well. Um, Andy,
And
this has just
I'm
been
gonna continue growing out my beard and mustache, because it's so important that the
yes.
beard and mustache have to continue. They haven't been cut since
They
before. It was, well, it was right about the time I wrote Quantum Leap that I stopped cutting my mustache, and so it
okay.
hasn't been cut since about the time I wrote that Quantum Leap. And the beard comes and goes in different sizes, but the mustache is about concurrent with Quantum Leap.
Speaking as a man who cannot grow facial hair even when he tries, I say if you can do it, go for it. Do not never lose the facial hair. And Andy, it's been an absolute pleasure. I could definitely, if it wasn't 12:30 at night, I could continue talking to you for hours. But yeah, it's the wee hours here in England, so
It'll be a long
I'll,
podcast, Matt.
absolutely. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing your time, your stories, your positivity, and good luck for all the stories you have still to tell.
Thank you, Matt, for a wonderful interview, and to all the quantum leapers out there. Just remember to keep putting right what once went wrong.